Some stories are born in thunderclaps, others in the quiet rustle of a turning page. This one began with the clinking of fine china in a room that smelled of beeswax and old money. It's about a young woman who was an expert at being invisible, a titan of the modern world who saw people as data points and a string of words spoken in a language as ancient as the poetry it described. He meant them as a cudgel to shatter her composure. He believed his power was absolute and her world was small enough to fit on the tray she carried. He was about to discover that some people carry entire libraries within them, and that true value isn't disruptive, it's enduring. The Gilded Quill was less a restaurant and more a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the 21st century. Nestled in a gray stone building on a quiet, tree-lined street in Chicago's Gold Coast, it was an institution. Its proprietor, Alistair Finch, a man whose tweed jacket seemed to have grown on him, believed in the sanctity of starched linen, the civilizing influence of a properly chilled martini, and the importance of a staff who could be trusted with the city's most sensitive secrets. The clientele was a mix of old Chicago families who measured their lineage in generations, not dollars, and the occasional political heavyweight who came for the discretion and the Dover soul. Clara Mayhew, at 23, was a master of the silent arts required by such an establishment. She moved with a practiced grace that made her seem like a part of the mahogany-paneled decor. She was observant, efficient, and so quiet that patrons often only noticed her when their water glass was suddenly, magically full. This anonymity was a cloak she wore gladly. Her uniform, a simple, elegant black dress, was her defense against a world that was too loud, too fast. Most diners saw a pleasant, unremarkable young woman with watchful blue eyes and hands that were never still. They didn't see the faint, indelible ink stains on the tips of her fingers, remnants of late nights spent hunched over rare books. They didn't notice the weariness in her shoulders, a burden not just from long shifts, but from the weight of a legacy she felt wholly inadequate to carry. They couldn't know that her small apartment in Lincoln Park was a museum in miniature, filled not with furniture but with her grandfather's life's work. Shelves of books on South Asian history, framed fragments of antique textiles, and hand-drawn maps of ancient trade routes. They didn't know that the intricate floral pattern she sometimes doodled on a napkin while waiting for an order was a 17th century kalamkari motif, sketched from memory. Clara wasn't just a waitress, she was the custodian of a forgotten world, a student of art history at the University of Chicago, trying to make sense of the universe of beauty her late grandfather, a renowned Indologist and diplomat, had bequeathed to her. On this particular blustery Wednesday evening, the air in the Gilded Quill was thick with the scent of roasting duck and the low murmur of consequential conversations. A man walked in, and the delicate atmosphere of the room seemed to crackle and bend around him. Julian Croft didn't enter spaces, he consumed them. He was a creature of the new age, a tech billionaire who had built an empire on the principle of disruption. He was dressed in a stark, minimalist suit of a material that looked like it had been woven from shadows and algorithms. It likely cost more than Alistair Finch's entire collection of vintage port. Croft saw history not as something to be preserved, but as an inefficient data set to be optimized. With him were two men, his chief of operations, a nervous, perpetually eager young man named Ben, and Arthur Vance. Arthur was different. In his late 50s, he wore a classically tailored suit that spoke of old-school Savile Row, not a Silicon Valley lab. He was Croft's COO, the seasoned, steady hand hired to translate Croft's chaotic genius into something Wall Street could understand. Arthur carried himself with a quiet gravitas that seemed at odds with his boss's predatory energy. From her post near the kitchen, Clara saw Mr. Finch greet them, his usual cordiality stretched thin over a visible layer of anxiety. She knew why. Croft's monolithic company, Nexus Corp., had recently acquired the investment firm that held the mortgage on their entire historic block. The rumors were already swirling. Croft planned to tear it all down to build a Nexus Innovation Hub, a sterile tower of glass and steel that would cast a permanent shadow over their cobblestone street. "The corner table," Croft commanded, pointing with his phone, "and get us a bottle of Macallan 25. We're beta testing the future." Mr. Finch's smile was pained, but he led them to the restaurant's most coveted booth. Clara drew the short straw. Her section. A knot tightened in her stomach. She took a slow, calming breath, the way her grandfather had taught her, smoothed her apron, and walked towards the epicenter of the disruption. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice a model of professional calm. "May I get you started with some water while you wait for your scotch?" Croft didn't look up from his tablet, a wafer-thin device of his own company's design. "Just get the drinks," he said, a flick of his wrist dismissing her. Ben, the younger associate, offered a weak, apologetic smile. Arthur Vance, however, met her eyes for a brief moment. She saw in them a flicker of something she recognized from her art history texts, the weary resignation of a Roman senator forced to serve a volatile new emperor. For the next hour, Clara was a phantom of perfect service. She remained stoic as Croft loudly took a video call, his voice sharp and laced with jargon about synergizing pain points and monetizing human capital, slicing through the restaurant's gentle hum. She ignored the condescending way Ben ordered his meal, over-explaining every dietary restriction as if she were incapable of understanding. Arthur was quiet, his gaze often drifting to the ornate plasterwork on the ceiling, a man seemingly appreciative of the very things his boss was planning to annihilate. The tension at the table was a palpable force emanating from Croft. He was a man who vibrated with impatience, who saw the ritual of a fine meal as a frustrating waste of bandwidth. When his steak arrived medium rare instead of the bleu, practically still mooing he had demanded, he didn't complain. He simply pushed the plate away and glared at it, a silent, damning indictment that was more intimidating than any shout. Clara handled it all with the serene efficiency that was her trademark. She had served entitled patrons before. She had navigated far more complex social structures in the pages of her grandfather's books. She was a still point in the turning, chaotic world of Julian Croft. The moment that would change everything arrived not with a spill, but with a swipe of a finger. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain streaking down the tall, leaded glass windows. Croft had finished his tirade about the city's archaic zoning laws and had turned his attention to a new venture. He was pitching Arthur and Ben on his latest disruption, an AI-driven platform that could analyze, replicate, and improve any artisanal craft in the world. "Human hands are slow, they're inconsistent," Croft declared, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "Our AI, which we're calling Daedalus, can scan 1,000,000 examples of, say, ancient pottery, and generate a new design that is objectively more perfect, more symmetrical, more appealing to the human eye. We start with textiles. We're going to revolutionize the fashion and design industry." He swiped on his tablet, and a vibrant, intricate image appeared on the screen. It was a digital rendering of a classic Tree of Life motif, instantly recognizable to Clara. It was kalamkari, the ancient Indian art of hand-painting cotton textiles. "This," Croft said with a triumphant smirk, "is our first target. We're in the final stages of a massive deal with a manufacturing conglomerate in Mumbai. Daedalus has already absorbed the entire history of this Kalam something and is creating superior versions. We'll be able to produce it for a fraction of the cost with zero imperfections." Clara had approached to clear the dessert plates. As she reached for Croft's empty espresso cup, her eyes fell on the image on his tablet. Her training, her entire life steeped in the study of these objects, took over. She saw it instantly, a small but profoundly significant detail. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. She couldn't help herself. It was a reflex, born of a deep, abiding respect for the art. Croft looked up, his brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. "What is it?" "The rendering," she said, her gaze fixed on the screen. "It's beautiful, but the peacock, at the base of the tree, its head is turned to the left." Croft stared at her, then at the tablet, as if she'd started speaking in tongues. "And? It's a bird. It can look left." "In the traditional southern kalamkari style," Clara continued, her voice still quiet but gaining a new academic precision, "when a peacock is depicted at the root of the tree of life, it symbolizes watchfulness and protection. Its head should always face right, toward the rising sun, toward new beginnings. Facing left, It signifies an ending. Regret. It's iconographically incorrect. A thick, heavy silence descended upon the table. Ben's jaw was slack. Arthur Vance was looking at Clara with an expression of utter astonishment. Julian Croft's face, which had been alight with messianic zeal, slowly hardened into a mask of cold fury. He wasn't just being corrected. A waitress, a non-entity, was questioning the perfection of his billion-dollar algorithm in front of his senior staff. She had found a flaw not in the code, but in its soul. He slowly set his tablet down. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned forward, creating a chilling bubble of intimacy. He decided to use the language he'd been cramming for his Mumbai deal, a language he saw as just another tool for dominance, a way to put inferiors in their place. He switched to Hindi, the words clipped, brutal, and spoken with the harsh, arrogant accent of a man who learns a language for conquest, not communication. Chup raho, anapad ladaki, tumhari auqat kya hai? Tum bas ek naukar ho, dhool ke barabar. The venom in his tone was unmistakable, even to those who didn't understand the words. He had told her to shut up. He had called her an illiterate girl. He had asked her what her status was, and then, the final crushing blow. You are just a servant, equal to dust. It was a classist, deeply cutting insult, designed to remind her of her insignificance, to erase her from the conversation completely. He smiled, a thin, cruel line. He expected to see her flinch, to see tears of confusion and humiliation well in her eyes. He leaned back, ready to summon Mr. Finch and have her fired for her insolence. He had delivered his masterstroke. But Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. For the first time all evening, the ghost of the perfect waitress vanished, and the granddaughter of Professor Alistair Mayhew stood in her place. Her posture straightened, her spine becoming a rod of steel. She lifted her chin, and her blue eyes, no longer merely watchful, but blazing with a cold, clear fire, met his. The quiet girl was gone, replaced by a scholar and a guardian. A moment of profound silence hung in the air. Then she answered him. The Hindi Julian Croft had spoken was a weapon. It was the functional, transactional language of the marketplace, stripped of all grace. The Hindi that Clara Mayhew spoke in return was a song. It flowed from her not with the hesitation of a student, but with the fluid, lyrical cadence of someone who had grown up hearing the epic poems of the Mahabharata, read aloud by a grandfather who loved the language's very soul. It was the refined, slightly archaic Hindi of scholars and poets, learned not in a boardroom, but in a dusty, sunlit study filled with the scent of old paper and sandalwood. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the stunned silence of the restaurant with the clarity of a temple bell. Mahode, dhul bhi apani jagah mahatvapurn hoti hai, she began, her tone impeccably polite, yet edged with ice. यह उन चीजों को पोषित कराती है जो बढ़ाती हैं. कुछ लोग कांच के महल बनाते हैं, या भूल जाते हैं कि उनकी नींव रेत पर ही खड़ी है. The words were a quiet thunderclap. Julian Croft's smirk evaporated, his jaw tightening as the blood drained from his face. Shock, raw, unadulterated disbelief widened his eyes. Ben and Arthur stared, utterly bewildered, understanding only that a tectonic shift in power had just occurred at their table. With breathtaking fluency and a perfect scholarly accent, Clara had just informed him. Sir, even dust has its importance. It nourishes the things that grow. Some men build palaces of glass, forgetting that their foundations stand on sand. She wasn't finished. Holding his stunned gaze, she delivered the final devastating critique, her voice remaining level, almost gentle, which only amplified its power. और आपकी कलाकृति के लाए, आपका AI बेल को तो देख सकाता है, लेकिन उसकी आत्मा को नहीं. एक कारीगर गलतियां नहीं कराता, महोदय, वह अपनी कहानी लिखाता है. And as for your masterpiece, your AI can see the vine, but not its soul. An artisan doesn't make mistakes, sir. He writes his story. Every syllable was a perfectly placed stone in a mosaic of intellectual annihilation. She had not only deflected his insult, but she had also turned it back on him, using the very culture he sought to exploit as her shield and her sword. She had articulated the fundamental flaw in his entire worldview, that human creation, with all its imperfections and stories, possessed a soul that no algorithm could ever replicate. Julian Croft, a man who could command markets and bend politicians to his will with a single tweet, was rendered utterly, completely speechless. It was as if she had reached into his source code and found a fatal bug. He, a titan of words, of data, of communication, had been silenced. He could only stare at this waitress, this dust, who had so elegantly and thoroughly dismantled his entire reality. Who was she? The accent? The vocabulary? It wasn't from a language app. It was lived in. It was the sound of a world he was trying to buy, but which she so clearly inhabited. Mr. Finch broke the spell, hurrying over, his face a mask of panic. "Mr. Croft! Clara! Is there a problem here?" Clara's gaze finally unlocked from Croft's. She turned to her boss, and the fire in her eyes softened back into a familiar, weary resolve. The scholar retreated, and the waitress returned, but she was irrevocably changed. "No problem, Alistair," she said in English, her voice steady. "There was a misunderstanding about the artwork. I was simply clarifying a point for the gentleman." Clarifying? The word was a masterpiece of understatement. She had performed a vivisection of his philosophy and called it a clarification. Croft found his voice, but it was a dry, rasping thing he didn't recognize. "Get my coat," he bit out at Ben, his eyes still fixed on Clara. "But Julian, the acquisition strategy? We were going to—" Ben stammered. "Now!" Croft snarled. Ben and Arthur scrambled up, fumbling for their coats. Croft continued to stare at Clara, his expression no longer one of arrogance, but of a profound, disoriented confusion. He was trying to reconcile the waitress before him with the intellectual giant who had just taken him apart. He threw a thick wad of cash onto the table, far more than the bill, but it wasn't a tip. It was a ransom, a payment to be released from this moment. Without another word, he spun on his heel and strode out of the restaurant, his lieutenant scurrying in his wake. The heavy oak door swung shut, leaving a silence that was louder than his entire tirade. For a moment, the entire restaurant was a tableau vivant. Every diner was looking at Clara. She stood beside the table, a lone silver tray in her hand, looking both small and monumental. Then a woman at a nearby table, an elegant lady with silver hair and a knowing smile, began to applaud. It was a soft, graceful clap. She was Dr. Anjali Sharma, a visiting professor of Sanskrit literature at the university and a regular at the Gilded Quill. She had understood every nuanced syllable. Her applause was soon joined by others, a ripple of support that grew into a warm, sustained ovation. Clara's cheeks flushed a deep crimson. This was the antithesis of the invisibility she cultivated. She felt utterly exposed. She gave a small, jerky nod to the room, then turned and fled to the sanctuary of the kitchen, her heart hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. In the kitchen, the staff erupted. "Clara, what in God's name did you say to him?" a fellow waiter asked, his eyes like saucers. Clara leaned against the cool stainless steel prep table, gasping for breath. She couldn't explain that for a brief, transcendent moment, she wasn't Clara the waitress. She was Alistair Mayhew's granddaughter, the keeper of his flame. She was the girl who had spent her childhood tracing the intricate patterns of 1,000 years of art, listening to her grandfather explain that every line, every color, every choice had a meaning, a purpose, a story. The language Croft had used as a bludgeon was the language of her grandfather's lullabies, the language of beauty and wisdom, the language of her most cherished memories. When Croft had debased it, had used it to call her dust, he hadn't just insulted her, he had desecrated a sacred space, and the quiet, grieving part of her soul, the part that missed her grandfather with an ache that never faded, had finally spoken up. But as the adrenaline began to recede, a cold, terrifying reality washed over her. She hadn't just put a rude customer in his place. She had publicly eviscerated Julian Croft, a man who moved mountains of capital and raised city blocks that displeased him. A man who held the fate of the Gilded Quill, her only haven, her only connection to a life of stability, in the palm of his hand. She had won the argument. But she had a horrifying feeling she had just declared a war she had absolutely no chance of winning. The world outside the Gilded Quill operated at the speed of data, Julian Croft's native element. He had assumed his vicious private rebuke would be a contained event, a quick and brutal reestablishment of the social order. He had failed to account for the ever-present witnesses of the digital age. At a table by the window, a young journalist specializing in the tech industry had been dining with a source. She hadn't understood the Hindi, but she was fluent in the language of power dynamics. She saw the tense exchange, the billionaire's dismissive gesture, the waitress's quiet correction, and Croft's face contorting with rage. It was a story. She had discreetly activated the voice recorder on her phone just as Croft leaned in. She captured everything: his guttural, insulting Hindi, Clara's stunningly poetic reply, Croft's dumbfounded silence, and the final, spontaneous applause led by the distinguished-looking woman. Before her check even arrived, she had transcribed the Hindi, sent it to a contact for a quick, accurate translation, and fired off a pitch to her editor. The headline she suggested was pure, irresistible clickbait. Tech mogul Julian Croft's artisanal AI. Pitch ends with him being schooled in Hindi by Waitress. By the time Clara was walking home through the rain-swept Chicago streets, her mind a maelstrom of exhilaration and dread. The story was live. It didn't just go viral, it went supernova. It was picked up by tech blogs, cultural websites, and mainstream news outlets. The audio clip was embedded in tens of thousands of tweets. Commentators fluent in Hindi immediately confirmed the accuracy of the translations, adding layers of cultural context. They explained the depth of Croft's insult, not just rude but a jab at caste and class. They marveled at the elegance of Clara's reply, praising its philosophical depth and linguistic beauty. She became an instant icon of quiet defiance. They didn't know her name, so the internet gave her one: the Quill Girl. Quill Girl began trending globally. Memes exploded across social media. The juxtaposition of Croft's ugly insult, equal to dust, with her profound reply, even dust nourishes the things that grow, became a symbol of wisdom versus arrogance, of humanism versus soulless tech. Clara, oblivious to her newfound fame, arrived at her small, book-lined apartment. The scent of aging paper and dried ink was usually a comfort, but tonight it felt like an accusation. Her grandfather had taught her wisdom, but he had also taught her prudence. What she had done felt brave, but also reckless. She sank into her worn armchair, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was Alistair Finch. "Clara, my dear girl, are you seeing this?" His voice was a fragile mix of awe and terror. "Seeing what, Alistair?" she asked, her heart sinking. "The news, the internet, it's everywhere. They're calling you the Quill Girl." He paused. "Clara, it was magnificent, truly. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. You were the very soul of this place, speaking truth to power." Alistair's praise was a small, warm balm on her frayed nerves. "I'm so sorry, Alistair. I never intended for—" "Nonsense, child. You have nothing to apologize for," he interrupted, though his voice wavered. "But we must be realistic. Julian Croft is not a man who tolerates being made a fool of. This victory, I fear it will be short-lived." His words were prophetic. Just as she hung up, an email notification pinged on her laptop. It was from Alistair, forwarding a message he had just received. The sender was the legal department of Nexus Corp. The subject line was stark: "Notice of mortgage default and acceleration." With trembling hands, she read the cold, jargon-filled text. Nexus Corp, as the new holder of the mortgage, had conducted a full review and found a series of minor, decades-old covenant breaches in the building's charter. They were technicalities so obscure no one had thought of them in half a century, but they were technically violations. The letter declared the full balance of the loan, millions of dollars, due and payable within 72 hours. Failure to pay would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. It wasn't an eviction notice. It was a financial execution, a death sentence delivered by email. There was no way Alistair could produce that kind of money in 3 days. Croft wasn't just going to demolish the building, he was going to seize it, bleed it dry, and leave its owner ruined as punishment. Her act of defiance hadn't just cost Alistair his building, it was going to cost him everything. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Meanwhile, in his penthouse overlooking the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan, Julian Croft was not feeling triumphant. He was watching his company's stock ticker bleed red. The story had hit the Asian markets, and the reaction was brutal. His potential partners in Mumbai, the Adani Manufacturing Group, were a deeply traditional, family-run conglomerate. For them, respect, honor, and an understanding of culture were paramount. His phone rang. The caller ID read, Rohan Adani, the patriarch of the family. Julian, the voice on the other end was cold, devoid of its usual warmth. I have been reading some troubling news. Rohan, it's a misunderstanding. A disgruntled employee. A misunderstanding. Adani cut him off. I listened to the audio. My granddaughter translated your Hindi for me. Anapad Ladaki. Dul ke barabar. Is this how Nexus Corp shows its respect for the culture it wishes to profit from? By insulting a young woman with the vocabulary of a colonial overseer? That is not what... And the young woman, Adani continued, his voice like chipping stone. Her reply was poetry. It showed a deeper understanding of our philosophy than anything in your 100-page proposal. She spoke of dust-nourishing life. We believe that. You, it seems, believe only in bulldozing it. The board has met. We are putting our partnership on indefinite hold. We cannot do business with a man who has shown such profound disrespect. Do not contact us again. The line went dead. Julian Croft stared at his phone. The deal wasn't just a deal, it was worth billions. It was the cornerstone of his entire 5-year expansion plan. It was his gateway to a subcontinent of 1 billion consumers. And it had just been incinerated. Because of a waitress. The humiliation from the restaurant was nothing compared to this. This was a direct blow to his empire. He felt a rage so pure, so absolute, it was almost clarifying. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. Arthur, he bellowed, his voice echoing in the vast empty apartment. Arthur Vance appeared in the doorway of the living room, his face grim. He had already seen the news from Mumbai. Find her, Croft seethed, pacing like a caged animal. Not her name from the restaurant payroll. I want everything. I want to know who taught her to speak like that. I want to know where she comes from, who she knows. I want a weapon to use against her. I want to know her pressure points. I am going to dismantle her life, piece by piece, until she is nothing but the dust I said she was. Arthur, a man who had navigated hostile takeovers and corporate espionage, simply nodded. I'll get it done, Julian. But as he turned to leave, he felt a deep unease. He had seen the look in Clara's eyes. He had heard the soul in her voice. And for the first time, he wondered if his boss had finally picked a fight with a force his money couldn't conquer. Julian Croft wanted to find a weakness. Arthur Vance had a sinking feeling they were about to discover a strength they couldn't possibly comprehend. Arthur Vance was a man of quiet competence. In a world of disruptors, he was a preserver. He had joined Nexus Corp after Croft had acquired and dismantled his family's century-old investment firm, choosing to stay on not out of loyalty, but a grim sense of responsibility to the employees who remained. He was a creature of the old world, and he moved through the new with the caution of a historian in a minefield. His task was to dig up dirt on Clara Mayhew, to find a vulnerability Croft could exploit. He outsourced the initial data trawl to a discreet corporate intelligence firm, a group of ex-federal agents who could find a ghost in a snowstorm. Within hours, the preliminary file was on his encrypted server. The subject, Clara E. Mayhew. Arthur opened it in his study at home, a room paneled in dark cherry wood and lined with first editions. The city lights twinkled below, a world away from the storm brewing in his professional life. He expected a simple, perhaps tragic story, an immigrant family, a passion for languages. He was looking for a chink in her armor. The first few pages were mundane. Name Clara Elizabeth Mayhew, age 23. Born and raised in Evanston, Illinois. A clean record, excellent grades. Current student, University of Chicago, Department of Art History, specializing in South and Southeast Asian textiles. Occupation, waitress at the Gilded Quill. No debt, no criminal record, no obvious weaknesses. Then he got to the family history section. Father, deceased. Mother, deceased. Both died in a car accident when Clara was 16. His breath caught. She was an orphan. She had been raised by her maternal grandfather. Arthur's eyes scanned down to the name, and the world seemed to slow down. Maternal grandfather, Professor Alistair C. Mayhew. Arthur felt a jolt of recognition so profound it was almost physical. He leaned forward, his face close to the screen. It couldn't be the same man. He stood, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled down a heavy leather-bound volume. Threads of the Divine, Iconography in Post-Muggle Textiles. The author was Professor Alistair Mayhew. Arthur had bought the book 20 years ago after a trip to India, captivated by the country's rich artistic traditions. He scrambled back to the computer and opened a new browser tab, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The search results flooded the screen. Professor Alistair Mayhew wasn't just an academic. He was a legend in the world of diplomacy and cultural studies. A Rhodes Scholar, a long-serving cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, a trusted advisor to presidents, and one of the world's foremost experts on Indian art and languages. He had been instrumental in negotiating the return of stolen antiquities and had dedicated his life to fostering a deeper understanding between the West and the subcontinent. His work was cited in museums and universities worldwide. He was, Arthur realized with a dawning sense of horror, a man Rohan Adani would have known and deeply respected. The intelligence file continued, painting a picture not of hardship, but of profound intellectual inheritance. It included photos of a young Clara at her grandfather's side at museum openings, in the dusty archives of Indian universities, sitting on the floor of village workshops watching artisans weave silk. The file contained an excerpt from the professor's will. He had left everything, his apartment, his extensive library, his priceless collection of textiles and artifacts, to his beloved granddaughter Clara, the keeper of my heart and my legacy. The final item in the dossier was a link to a video. It was from a university lecture series, filmed a few years before the professor's death. The title was The Soul of the Artisan. Arthur clicked it. Professor Mayhew, a man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, stood at a podium. He spoke with a passion that was both scholarly and deeply personal. In our modern rush to optimize and digitize, he said, his voice resonating with gentle authority, we risk losing the language of the human hand. An algorithm can replicate a pattern, but it cannot replicate the intention, the prayer, the centuries of ancestral memory that guide the artisan's fingers. A flaw in a hand-woven carpet is not a mistake. It is the signature of a human soul. It is the story. Arthur leaned back, the professor's words echoing in the silent room. An artisan doesn't make mistakes, sir. He writes his story. She had been quoting him. She had been channeling him. He felt a cold dread mixed with a strange, soaring admiration. Julian Croft had not insulted a waitress. He had insulted the sole heir and living embodiment of Professor Alistair Mayhew's entire life's work. He had picked a fight not with a servant, but with a legacy. And he had done it in front of the very people, like Rohan Adani, who revered that legacy above all else. The weapon Croft had demanded, the pressure point he wanted to use to destroy her, was in fact Clara's greatest strength. It was her armor, her inheritance, her identity. Using it against her would be like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It would only make the conflagration worse, incinerating what little was left of Nexus Corp's reputation and the Adani deal along with it. The path forward was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. They couldn't fight her. They couldn't silence her. The only way to save the company, to salvage the deal, to fix the catastrophic mess Julian had made, was to do the one thing he was constitutionally incapable of doing: surrender. Arthur picked up his phone. He didn't call Julian. He called his own longtime personal assistant. "Catherine," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to find a way to contact a young woman named Clara Mayhew. Quietly, I need to speak with her. and it cannot, under any circumstances, get back to Mr. Croft. He paused, taking a deep breath. Tell her, tell her it's about her grandfather. He was going rogue. It was a career-ending risk, but the alternative, watching Julian Croft drive his empire and his own humanity off a cliff, was no longer an option. The digital storm had an unintended consequence. It had turned Clara's life upside down, but it had also brought her to the attention of people who understood her world. Dr. Anjali Sharma, the professor who had started the applause, sought her out at the university. She found Clara in the hushed, cavernous reading room of the Regenstein Library, surrounded by books on Mughal art, looking pale and hunted. Miss Mayhew, Dr. Sharma said, her voice a gentle melody. I was there the other night. I am a great admirer of your grandfather's work. What you did, he would have been immensely proud. Over coffee in the library's small cafe, Clara for the first time unburdened herself. She spoke of her fear for Alistair Finch, her guilt over the foreclosure notice, and her feeling of being a small, fragile boat in a hurricane. Dr. Sharma listened with the deep, patient empathy of a true scholar. Dignity is never a mistake, Clara, she said firmly. You held up a mirror to a man who had forgotten what a human soul looks like. The consequences are his to bear, not yours. Inspired, Dr. Sharma made calls of her own. She spoke to the Dean of the Humanities Division. She spoke to the curator of the Art Institute of Chicago. She contacted a prominent journalist at the Chicago Tribune, a woman known for her long-form pieces on culture in the city's soul. The narrative began to evolve. The story was no longer just a viral clip of a billionaire getting his comeuppance. It became the story of Alistair Mayhew's granddaughter, a young scholar defending not just her own dignity, but the sanctity of human artistry against the relentless march of a tech behemoth. It became a story about Chicago itself, a battle between the city's historic, human-scale soul and the cold, glass and steel ambition of men like Croft. Small protests began outside the now shuttered Gilded Quill. Art students, history professors, and ordinary Chicagoans who loved the city's character held signs reading, "Art is not an algorithm," and "Save the Quill." The city's Landmark Preservation Council, under a sudden deluge of public pressure, announced an emergency hearing on the historical status of the entire block, a move that would legally freeze any demolition or foreclosure proceedings for months. Julian Croft found himself ensnared in a web of complications he couldn't just buy his way out of. His army of lawyers could fight, but the battle was no longer in the courtroom. It was in the court of public opinion, and he was losing on a global scale. His sterile, PR-vetted apology, released online, was torn apart as a hollow gesture of a man trying to save a business deal, not redeem his character. He was trapped in his penthouse, a prisoner in his own ivory tower. The Adani deal a smoking crater in the center of his balance sheet. The more he raged, the deeper he sank. It was into this chaos that Arthur Vance walked, his face set like stone. "I have the file on the girl," Arthur said, standing before Julian's desk. "Good," Croft snarled, looking up from a spreadsheet of devastating financial projections. "Give it to me. What's the weakness?" Arthur didn't move. Her grandfather was Professor Alistair Mayhew. The name hung in the air. Croft's face was blank. "Who?" "The world's leading Indologist for the last 40 years, Arthur said, his voice cold. "A man whose books are in Rohan Adani's personal library. A man who is a legend in the world you just tried to conquer. The girl isn't just a waitress who knows Hindi, Julian. She's royalty. In the circles that matter for this deal, she has more credibility, more respect than you could buy in 100 lifetimes." Croft stared at him, the reality of the situation slowly dawning. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying there is no weakness," Arthur stated flatly. "There is no pressure point. Pushing her is pushing the very culture we need to embrace. Every move you make against her is another nail in the coffin of the Adani deal. We have one move left. It's not a legal strategy. It's not a PR strategy." "What is it?" Croft demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Humility," Arthur said, the word sounding foreign and strange in the sterile office. "You are going to meet with her. You are going to listen, and you are going to beg her for help, because right now, Julian, She is the only person on this planet who can save your company from the damage you have done to it." Julian Croft looked from Arthur's unflinching gaze to the city below, a city that now saw him as a villain. He, a master of the universe, was being told to grovel to a waitress. The old him would have fired Arthur on the spot, but the old him wasn't facing the ruin of his life's work. For the first time, the disruptor had been truly, utterly disrupted. "Set it up," Julian said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The meeting was set on Clara's terms, not in a corporate boardroom or a lawyer's office, but at the Art Institute of Chicago, in the Alsdorf galleries of Indian, Southeast Asian, Himalayan, and Islamic art. It was a space where she felt grounded, surrounded by the silent, powerful testimony of the artisans she so admired. She arrived first, drawing strength from the intricate carvings and serene stone gods that lined the halls. She wore a simple dress, but carried herself with a newfound confidence. When Julian Croft and Arthur Vance arrived, she was standing before a magnificent 18th century kalamkari hanging, a vast, intricate tapestry depicting scenes from the Ramayana. Croft looked different out of his natural habitat. In the hushed, reverent gallery, his expensive suit seemed garish, his restless energy discordant. He stopped a few feet away, looking awkward and out of place. Arthur gave Clara a respectful nod. "Miss Mayhew," Croft began, his voice strained, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Clara didn't reply immediately. She gestured to the tapestry. "It took a family of artisans 12 years to make this," she said, her voice clear and calm. "They used all natural dyes, pomegranate for the reds, indigo for the blues, myrobalan flower for the yellows. Every figure tells a part of a larger story, a story that has been passed down for thousands of years." She finally turned to face him. "Your algorithm, Mr. Croft, how long would it take to tell a story like that?" The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. It cut straight to the heart of their conflict. Croft had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It couldn't," he admitted, the words feeling like pulling teeth. "It can replicate an image. It can't replicate a soul." He had clearly been rehearsing. "My lawyers have drafted an apology." He started again, reverting to his script. "I'm not interested in an apology drafted by lawyers, Mr. Croft," Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm interested in understanding. Why are you here?" It was Arthur who stepped forward. "We're here, Miss Mayhew, because we are in trouble. The Adani partnership is dead. Our reputation in the region is in tatters. Julian, he made a catastrophic error, born of arrogance and ignorance. We are here because we believe you are the only person who can help us." This was the truth, raw and transactional. Clara appreciated the honesty. "Help you?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "Why on earth would I do that? You tried to ruin a good man, Alistair Finch, and destroy his life's work. You insulted me, and more importantly, you insulted a culture you know nothing about." "Because," Croft said, finally finding his own voice raw and unscripted, "because you were right. About everything. About the peacock. About the dust. About the soul." He looked around the gallery at the millennia of human creation surrounding them. "I've spent my life building things out of code and capital. I thought it was the future. But looking at this, I realize I've been building with sand." He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a titan of industry, but a man profoundly lost. "The Adani deal. It's not just about money. It's about legacy. I want to build something that lasts. I thought technology was the only way. I was wrong." He took a step closer. "I am dissolving the Daedalus project. Effective immediately. I am canceling the foreclosure on Mr. Finch's building and will personally fund the repairs in compensation for his lost business. The plans for the Nexus hub on that block are scrapped." Clara was taken aback by the totality of his surrender. It was more than she could have hoped for, but she remained silent, sensing there was more. "I want to propose something else," Croft continued, his voice gaining a desperate energy. "A new venture. I want to create a foundation, the Mayhew Nexus Foundation for the Preservation of Artisanal Craft. Its mission will be to identify, fund, and protect master artisans around the world. We will use Nexus technology not to replace them, but to archive their techniques, to connect them with a global market, to ensure their stories are not lost." He looked at her, his expression raw with a plea. But I can't lead it. I don't have the knowledge or the credibility. You do. I want to offer you the position of executive director, a full board, complete autonomy, and a starting endowment of $100 million. I'm not asking you to help me save my deal. I'm asking you to help me build something that actually matters, something that honors your grandfather's legacy instead of desecrating it. The offer was staggering. It was a blank check to do the work she had only ever dreamed of. It was a chance to turn her passion into a global force for good. But it was also a pact with the devil who had, days ago, tried to crush her. She looked at Arthur, searching his face. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He believed the offer was genuine. She then looked back at Croft, studying the man who had called her dust. She saw the ambition still there, but it was now tempered by a new, humbling fear, the fear of being meaningless. She thought of her grandfather. He was a pragmatist as well as an idealist. He believed in building bridges, even with imperfect partners. He would not want his legacy to be a reason for inaction. He would want her to seize the opportunity to do good in the world. "All right, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady. "I will consider your offer, but I have conditions." Croft's shoulders sagged with relief. "Anything." "First," she said, "the Foundation's charter will be irrevocable. Its funding will be guaranteed, independent of Nexus Corp's stock performance. Second, Mr. Finch and a representative from the Art Institute will have permanent seats on the board. Third, your public apology will not be about your business. It will be about your ignorance. You will publicly state the value of human artistry and the lesson you have learned." She paused, then delivered her final, most important condition. "And finally, you will come with me once a year to a village in Andhra Pradesh or a workshop in Rajasthan. Not as a billionaire, but as a student. You will sit on the floor and you will watch. You will learn." Julian Croft looked at this young woman, who stood before him with the poise of a queen, dictating the terms of his redemption. He saw not a waitress, but a leader. He saw the future, and it was nothing like the one he had planned. "Accepted," he said, without a moment's hesitation. He extended his hand. "All of it." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then back at the ancient tapestry. She thought of the 12 years it took to create, the patience, the dedication, the story in every thread. Building something of value took time. Building trust would take longer. Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand. A deal was struck. Not in a boardroom, but in a quiet gallery, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 years of art. It was not an ending. It was a new and far more intricate beginning. The announcement of the Mayhew Nexus Foundation sent a shockwave through the worlds of tech, art, and finance. It was a story of redemption so unexpected, so complete, that it dwarfed the initial scandal. Julian Croft's public apology was a masterpiece of humility, written not by lawyers, but, it was rumored, with significant input from Clara herself. He spoke of his profound and humbling education and the arrogance of assuming an algorithm can possess a soul. Rohan Adani, watching from Mumbai, sent a one-word email to Croft. "Intriguing." The partnership was not restored, not yet, but a door had been reopened. The next few years were a whirlwind for Clara. She finished her degree, but her real education took place in the field. She became a tireless champion for artisans, traveling the globe, her backpack filled with as many grant applications as art history books. She worked side by side with Julian and Arthur to build the foundation. The dynamic was a constant negotiation. Julian, transformed but still driven, learned the foreign language of patience. He had built an empire on speed and scale. Now he learned the value of slow, meticulous work. He watched, often in awe, as Clara navigated the delicate politics of cultural preservation, commanding respect not with wealth, but with a deep, authentic knowledge and an unwavering passion. She taught him that the most valuable assets couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Clara, in turn, learned from him. He taught her how to leverage his corporate machinery for good, how to build scalable systems that could deliver aid and resources efficiently to remote villages. She learned the language of logistics and finance, while he learned the language of human dignity. They forged an improbable, powerful partnership bound by a shared mission in a hard-won mutual respect. Arthur Vance, the man who had bridged the two worlds, became the foundation's chairman, his quiet wisdom the perfect ballast for Clara's passion and Julian's reformed ambition. The Gilded Quill, saved and revitalized with a grant from the Foundation for its historic preservation, became their unofficial headquarters, where plans to save a weaving tradition in Peru were hatched over coffee and scones. 5 years after their first explosive meeting, the Foundation held its inaugural summit at the Art Institute of Chicago. The centerpiece of the event was an exhibition titled The Artisan's Hand, featuring the work of the first 100 artisans the Foundation had supported. Clara, now a poised and respected leader in her field, stood at a podium in the gallery where she had made her deal. She looked out at the crowd, at Alistair Finch, beaming in the front row, at Dr. Sharma, at Arthur Vance, and at Julian Croft, who stood quietly at the back, preferring to let Clara and the artist take the spotlight. "We are often told that tradition is the enemy of progress," Clara said, her voice echoing in the hall, "that the future is a place where the past is erased. My grandfather taught me something different. He taught me that the past is a deep well from which we draw the wisdom to build a better future." She gestured to the stunning artworks around them. "This is not nostalgia. This is a living, breathing knowledge. In these threads, in this clay, in this wood, are the stories of who we are. The Mayhew Nexus Foundation is not here to save the past. We are here to ensure it has a future." Later that evening, as the crowds thinned, Clara found Julian standing alone before the same Kalamkari tapestry from their first meeting. He had just returned from their third trip to India together, and his face was more peaceful than she had ever seen it. "He would have been proud of you," Julian said softly, his eyes on the tapestry. "Your grandfather." Clara smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "He would have been surprised by you," she replied. "I think he would have found you to be a very interesting student." The anger and humiliation of that night in the restaurant felt like a story from another life. It had been a flash of lightning, one that had threatened to burn everything down, but had instead illuminated a completely new path. One of them had learned to see beyond the cold logic of code, and the other had found the courage to step out from behind the pages of the past and build a living legacy. In the heart of the city, in the quiet gallery, the ancient tapestry told its endless story. A testament that the most resilient threads are not of commerce or technology, but of human connection, of respect, and of the profound, simple courage to admit when you are wrong and begin the painstaking work of making it right. It was proof that even from dust, something truly beautiful could grow.